back when I was in high school, during Christmas vacation, I came to a realization, and that's, what do I really want to be when I grow up? At that stage in my life, you're kind of deciding, okay, what college do I want to go to and what major do I want to major in? And the thought hit me, what do I want to do with my life? And I was drawing a blank. So I asked myself a different question. I said, what could I see myself doing with my life? But that resulted in a really long list of things that I could see myself doing. And so I worked backwards and I decided, okay, I had this long list of everything I could see myself doing, like doctor, pastor, like computer science, like computer programmer. But what are the things, like what do I really want to do? Humoringly, looking back on the list, me speaking up to you right now, pastor was one of the things that got axed. Because I started crossing off, okay, I don't really want to do that. I don't really want to do that. And I settled on graphic design. And so I went to a Union College in Nebraska, and I graduated with a degree in graphic design. But as I worked through this process, another thought hit me, and that's oftentimes when we're growing up and when we're progressing through life, we have these big decisions and we can look forward and we can kind of project, what do I see this big decision causing, and what do I see the outcome of this big decision happening? And different studies say there's either 3 or 4 major decisions that we all make, one of which is the degree we major in or the college we go to. Those are kind of lumped together. Another one is who we're going to marry, or if we're going to get married, and if so, kind of tied with that one would be like whether or not we're going to have children. And then the third and final question is, what religion or lack of religion are we going to do? What are we going to do with our spirituality or our faith? And so as I wrestled with the what do I want to be when I grow up question, I came to this thought that oftentimes in our lives, we have these big questions, but going unnoticed with those big questions is a lot of other little decisions and little things that we don't often take nearly as seriously. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of decisions that each of us make on a day-to-day basis. We've already been making these decisions today because you've all decided to get out of bed and come to church today. And well, these are good decisions for the most part. Coming to church is a great decision, don't get me wrong, but there's plenty of decisions that could have gone in earlier this morning, like whether you hit the snooze button several times or whether how long you slept in and kind of cramped your morning. Like the decisions that we make, oftentimes we don't think about that there's a cost involved with them. The term that I've heard used is opportunity cost, and it's the cost that's involved with making a decision. With every decision, you kind of can see, okay, I'm going to decide to do this, but then there's a flip side to it, because when I decide to do this, what is it that I'm deciding not to do? What am I giving up? I don't have any real better way of explaining this idea of opportunity cost than to play a game with you guys this morning. And the game that I want to play with you, we're going to call opportunity cost. And so one moment while I set up my easel and present you guys with the game. Opportunity cost. Because as you've seen games like this before, you're presented with door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3. You don't know what's behind any of these doors, but you know you can only choose one. And so there's a cost involved because whichever door you pick, you're also choosing not to pick what's behind those other doors. So I've asked Dan to be a good volunteer and to be a good sport and to come up and choose one of these doors for us. And Dan, if you want to, you can elicit response from the congregation to see if there's people have an idea of what door do you think Dan should choose. Four. Which door do you want to choose? Let's do door number 1. All right. So before we open door number 1, I want to point out that at this point, most people or most game show contestants would want to draw out the suspense, and they would say, okay, well, he's chosen door number 1, so let's open one of these other 2 doors to see something that he didn't choose. But because we're a good sport and we're going to open up door number 1 so we can not leave you in suspense. What's going to be behind door number 1? Behind door number 1 is a fish. This could be a fishy tale, if you think about it. Because a fish, this reminds me of a story that I heard when I was growing up. And it was about a man who wanted to go out and catch an eagle. This is before the time, the story is set before there's tranquilizers and guns and all the sort of modern things that people would want to do. And but he's a smart person, and so he goes out into the forest looking for an eagle's nest, because if there's an eagle's nest, you're going to be able to find an eagle. Eagles make their nest in very inaccessible places, like up at the tops of cliffs or like in very like kind of inaccessible tops of trees. And to catch an eagle, one way would be to go to the nest, but eagles are also very smart, because if they sense that their nest has been tampered with, or if they see anything out of the ordinary, they're going to stay away. So when this man found an eagle's nest way up at the top of a cliff, you could see it, he then looked for a large rock, much larger than the rock that we have here today, but we'll call this scale size because I don't think I could actually lift the size of the rock that he found. And he took a fish and he laid the fish on the rock. And then he left for the night. Coming back the next day, the fish was gone. And so he laid another fish on. And he continued this practice for a week. Each day, bringing a new fish, putting the fish on the rock. On the 8th day, he brought something with him. It was a bamboo or a wire kind of contraption, and he fashioned a loop over the rock. This is also still scale size. And then he placed the fresh fish on the rock and left for the evening. And he continued this for another week, each day just bringing a new fish to replace the fish that was gone. And on the 15th day, start of the 3rd week, he brought with him some chicken wire, some loosely integrated wire, and he laid that over the loop. And some of you are starting to see what's happening because a trap is slowly starting to be set up. And he puts another fresh fish and he leaves for the night. And he continues this for a few more days until one day he comes and he brings some heavy-duty fishing line or some wire, something that's strong but not easy to be seen, and he loops it around the opposite side down to the base of the rock, kind of ties something in there, and then he pulls it out and hides in the brush. And he catches the eagle. We're, as humans, a lot like the eagle in this story. Because if we were to come upon a trap that's set for us, that something that Satan set for us that we don't know and we can see it really clearly as a trap, we're going to stay away. If an eagle sees the trap with the fish in there, it's just not going to worry about it. But Satan knows, like this man knew, that slow changes to the environment mixed with a little bit of convenience are ways that you can trap someone. We read this morning about Daniel and his 3 friends. And if you still have your Bibles open, turn back with me to that story, because we're going to walk through that. If you have the Pew Bibles, it's page 625. Give you a shortcut. And we're going to walk through this story, looking a little bit more closely at some of the events surrounding Daniel and his 3 friends as they've been taken into Babylon. Because Daniel and his 3 friends realize the way to stop getting caught in this trap. Starting in verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Don't worry, Dan, I struggle over these names too. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple. These carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. We'll pause here in the story to point out, when a king comes in and conquers another king, that usually meant in this era that anybody who was kind of the well-off, wealthy would have been put to death. However, Nebuchadnezzar was one of the first emperors to not do that. Instead of putting to death everyone who really could rally people together, who may have been seen as a leader, he pulled all of the young people together and he brought them to to Babylon. And instead of making them slaves, which is what Daniel and his friends thought when they were being led off to Babylon, they basically had kind of resigned their lives to the life of slavery. But when they get there, they learned that Nebuchadnezzar operates a little bit differently. Instead of squishing people down, he wants to hire them, bring them in. He wants to teach them the Babylonian way, because as we look at history, what he did was he took them through the schools, and then after they had learned the Babylonian way and become Babylonian, then he would send them back to be leaders in the provinces that they originally came from, and they acted as bridges. But as we read this story, and as we read some of the details of this school, we see something interesting. Like Daniel and his 3 friends were able to see the makings of a trap being formed, and Daniel and his 3 friends could see this. The king brought them in, and the first thing, or I guess it's Ashpenaz, brought them in, and the first thing that he did was he changed their name. He took away their old name, and names in this culture were very significant. The Hebrews' original names, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were all names that gave glory to the God of Israel, to Yahweh. And Ashpenaz took those names. He said, you're not going to be called by those names anymore. Instead, we're going to give you new names, and these new names are names that glorify the gods of Babylon. And I'm not as much of a scholar as it might sound, but each of these names kind of had a meaning. Like Belshazzar was, Bel is my God, and I don't remember what the other ones are, but it basically names that glorified Babylonian gods. And so that was become these people's new identity. And then mixed in with this was something interesting, and that's that the king had also ordered that these new recruits, these nobles in the school, were to be given food from his own chefs, food from his very own table, instead of kind of eating the meager kind of scraps that you would expect to be given to slaves. These students were to be served with whatever delicacies were in the land of Babylon. But Daniel and his three friends could see a trap forming because they could see their identity being stripped away from their names, and they also could see that the food that the king wanted to give them was not the best food for them, not the best food for their mind. And so let's continue in the story to see what happens. This is continuing in verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. But just want to point out here, this is a very valid argument. My life or just a little bit of food? Like, not really much of a comparison, but then Daniel, because he is determined to not defile himself, he goes the next step down. Verse 11, Daniel then said to the guard who the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. 10 days, such a short amount of time that the king wouldn't be able to tell any difference, but we know that your discerning eye, the chief official who had appointed, you would be able to see if there's a difference. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Chances are this probably didn't really offend the guard because he had a lot more food that he probably liked a lot better than just vegetables. But here in the story, after Daniel and his friends took a stand to say, we'll go up to this point, you can change our names, but we're not going to defile ourselves, we see God step in. Verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, this is about a 3-year period of time, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You could consider this kind of like a modern equivalent being the interview. Like, are you going to be the one to make it? Are you going to be the one to be chosen? And we see here that God steps in, gives Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah unusual abilities to understand, unusual wisdom, and I believe it's in part because they chose not to defile themselves. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all of the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. And I'm not sure, I don't know my biblical history well enough to know if that was a span of 5 years or a span of 15 years, but it was the rest of the time that Babylon was in power. Daniel was up as basically the head magician, the head advisor to the king. All because Daniel and his 3 friends counted the cost. They saw the trap that was being formed, and they said, we'll go up to this point, but we're going to take a stand because once we pass this point, the cost is too great. We see this also being played out in the New Testament, in Jesus' life, when he's being tempted. Flip several pages over to Matthew chapter 4, and we'll look at Jesus' temptations. And we're going to see how Jesus brings this out and determines to not, like he sees the trap and he determines to not fall into it. Matthew 4, verse 1. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Kind of one of those obvious things. After 4 minutes or after 4 hours, more likely, I'm hungry. But this is after 40 days. Verse 3, the tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended to him. In these 3 temptations, there's a lot of different layers that we can unpack. Because first off, when Satan opens each temptation that he presents towards Jesus by saying, if you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. If you are the Son of God, cast yourself down. If you are the Son of God, just bow down and I'll give all the kingdoms of the world to you. Satan has this underlying motive that he wants to cause Jesus to doubt in his God-given role, in the whole reason why he came to earth. Also, in each of these temptations, we see Satan offering Jesus a shortcut. Like, you're hungry. I know you are. You've been fasting out here for 40 days. Shortcut. Turn these stones into bread. I know you can do it. Next temptation, shortcut. We see that God has even promised that he won't bring any harm to you, but just go up to the top of the highest peak in the tallest temple, jump off, You won't have any harm come to you. And that's a pretty significant feat. And all of the religious leaders who know this prophecy, they would see this and they'd be like, well, that's got to be the Messiah because he didn't die. Shortcut. And then the third temptation, shortcut, is just bow down for a split second to me, and I'll give it all to you. No worrying about the cross, none of that stuff. We can just settle this here. But the real sinister trap that Satan was laying for Jesus in these three temptations is to get Jesus to turn his eyes, to turn away from God's mission for his life. Turn your focus from depending on God and satisfy your hunger through your own means. Turn your focus away from God and do something so miraculous that draws attention to yourself. Turn your focus off of God's mission just to me for a moment. This is Satan talking. And you can have it all and you don't have to worry about it. But Jesus, being wiser than any of us, pretty much anyone who ever has lived or anything, kind of the author of wisdom, sees these traps from a mile away and has already resolved to not take any steps towards them. Jesus counted the cost in each of these temptations and determined that the cost was too great to fall. The cost being all of our salvation. Amen. That's just amazing for me to think about. But bringing it back to us here in this room, how often do each of us go through our lives, go through our day-to-day experience and not count the cost of our decisions? How often do we just say, well, it's the easy way to go, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it the easy way, not paying much attention to what's at stake? But the problem with going through life this way is that we end up missing out on what God might have for us because we're not counting the cost. The way that we can begin to live more intentionally is by asking ourselves a question. And that question is really simply, what's the cost? What's the cost behind this decision? What am I saying no to by saying yes to this thing? Or what am I saying yes to by saying no to this? If I say yes to taking this job, will it mean saying no to my family because it's going to require me to be away from home more? Or if I say yes to the snooze button when my alarm clock goes off in the morning, am I saying no to being able to have time to spend with God? And is it going to squish my morning and make it feel rushed and cramped? What would our lives be like as a church, as a community, if all of us were to resolve and were to determine to live more intentionally, to count the cost of our decisions? What would it mean for us both in the immediate circumstance, in like the coming week, but then also as time went on, what would it mean for us as a group long-term, 5-10 years down the road, after we have incremental steps of improvement and incremental steps of living intentionally, leading us to where we want to go, which is closer to God for most of us. And closer to God means that we are able to get to heaven, because the relationship with God is where it's at. Thank you. And for those of you who are interested in what's behind door number 2 or door number 3, perhaps, but you'll have to wait until next week.